Let's hear it for the home team. We are very blessed, very blessed. So Halloween is just around the corner, and it gives us the opportunity to transform into something different in a light and fun way. So it gives you the opportunity to, look at your fears and the shadows and dressed up in costume. You can be a vampire, you can be a zombie, a priest, an angel, and you can walk around on Halloween and no one will give you a second thought probably, or a second glance, right? But if you did it on another day, like if you showed up at work dressed as a witch or something, people would look at you a little askew. So Halloween is really kind of fun because you can kind of take on a different persona, or you can embrace something even maybe that you're afraid of to step into on that day. Halloween also marks the turn of the seasons. The orange colors of this holiday are reflected in the pumpkins and the jack-o'-lanterns, in the gold of the trees. Aren't the trees beautiful? It seems like it took them forever this year to start turning, but once they did, it's been like, pshoom, it's been amazing. So as the nights become longer, our thoughts turn within, and there's a real kind of a deep silence that exists in this time of year as we head into the longer nights and the shorter days. And I called out the light in the room today because again, it sort of fits with the direction in which we're moving in this part of the hemisphere where it's getting darker. So our thoughts turn to darkness and perhaps even death, because that is what is reflected in this holiday. All Saints' Day is on November 1st, and that's a day to remember, of course, all the saints, but it's even to remember people that you considered angels or saints in your own life, right? To kind of like give praise and thanks for them. And, of course, the festivities for the Day of the Dead have already begun. My friends who live in Mexico are putting on Facebook all the festivities that are happening, where there's this honoring of the ancestors, where there's this dancing in the graveyard and this celebration of those who have gone before us. It was believed on All Hallows Eve that the dead would leave their graves, and they would seek the homes of the people that they loved. They wanted to go back to their homes. And so in villages, people would have bonfires in order to attract the souls to the bonfires instead of to the house. And I think that with all these traditions, right, there's a subliminal thing that's happening around Easter and Easter, around Halloween. I'm jumping ahead. You can see how I feel about the long nights. No. I'm already calling back the lights. But because this season naturally conjures up images of ghosts and death, it poses the question, what happens to us after we die? Right? And so I think there's a subliminal message in this holiday, because it isn't something that we talk about a whole lot or think about. We're kind of we are a death-defying society, right? We worship youth, and death and all of that is something that we sort of keep at bay. In fact, sometimes, and maybe you've done this, where you hear yourself saying, if I ever die. Have you ever said that? If I ever die, not when I die, but if I ever die, because it's so unbelievable that it could possibly happen. And it's crazy because we see it happening all the time, but yet somehow there's this thing like, yeah, but it's not going to happen to me, right? It's not going to happen to me. But when we are confronted with it, whether it be our own or whether it be the death of a loved one, I think it catapults us into asking the big questions in life, which is, where do we go? Where did my loved one go? What happens to us? And the thing is, there are as many answers to these questions as there are religions. And this, year, because in this month particularly, we've been doing inclusivity, right? So I've been, like we did the Golden Rule last week, and I looked at what do different religions say about the Golden Rule. So today what I want to look at is, what do different religions say about the afterlife? And what do you think about the afterlife? What is your own personal credo about that experience? Okay. So it is the one question that every culture has sought an answer to. When I was in Paestum, Italy, there was a town there that had been excavated, and it was over 2,000 years old. And on the tombs was painted an image that we saw over and over again, and it was of a man who was diving, and it looked like he was diving off of a cliff into the ocean, but really he was diving off of life into the unknown. And so this image was again all over the place, and it's a question that all traditions have sought to answer. So, in the Western world, we have been raised with the concept of heaven and hell, have we not? From the time we're little, whether you were born into a religious family or not, chances are, just because of our movies and our TV, we have this concept of heaven and hell. Heaven has the pearly gates, and hell has its fire and damnations. So I have to tell you a couple of heaven jokes, because when else do I get the opportunity? And if you've heard them, there's not that many heaven jokes. Anyway, so there were a couple of friends, they've been friends forever, and they loved baseball, right? They loved baseball. They played baseball. They watched baseball. Baseball was everything to them. And one of the friends says, "Hey, do you think that there's baseball in heaven?" And his friend said, "Well, I don't know." And they said, "Well, let's make a deal. Whoever dies first will come back and tell the other one whether there's baseball in heaven." And he said, "All right." So, they grew up, they got old, and one of them died. Sure enough, a couple days later, the one friend comes back, and he says, "Well, I have good news and I have bad news for you." And he says, "Well, what's the good news?" He goes, "The good news is there is baseball in heaven." And he says, "Wow, that's great. What's the bad news?" "The bad news is you're pitching tomorrow." And another one that sort of, kind of calls out what heaven, our image of heaven is. There was a man who was extremely wealthy, and he'd spent his whole life, gathering wealth. And he thought, I can't die and leave this behind. I got to take it with me. So he started praying to God over and over, and please, God, let me bring my wealth with me. Let me bring it with me. And finally, an angel appeared to him and said, "Well, we don't really do that. You've got to leave that stuff behind." And he said, "Well, could you ask God for me anyway?" And he said, "All right." So the angel asked God, came back, "All right, God said you could bring only one suitcase of stuff." And he's like, "Okay." So when he dies, the man comes with his suitcase, and he goes to the pearly gates, and St. Peter is standing there, and he's like, "You can't bring anything with you." And he said, No, I got a special dispensation from God. And go check. So he goes and he checks. He comes back. He goes, "All right, but I need to check to see what you have in it." So he opens it up. He looks, and it's filled with gold bars. And he says, "Why did you bring the sidewalk?" All right, you get the idea. You get the idea. So if we each could create our own image of heaven, what would that be? J.K. Rowling said that for her, heaven would be a library, that would be her heaven, right? What would be your heaven? So the definition of heaven is that it is described as a higher place, the holiest place, a paradise in contrast to hell or the underworld or the low places. So in Buddhism, there are several heavens, though they are not eternal. So in Buddhism, you will go to a level of heaven, and then as you develop good karma, then you get to go to a higher heaven until finally you reach nirvana, and you don't have to come back at all. In Chinese Confucian tradition, heaven is where the ancestors reside. And they also perceive heaven almost as a god itself, because they'll say heaven did this and heaven did that. In Islam, heaven is a physical place where every wish is immediately fulfilled. Those who dwell in heaven are said to wear costly attire. They have exquisite banquets. They recline on couches inlaid with gold or precious stones. It's not really that much different from the Christian version of heaven, is it? With the pearly gates and the golden sidewalks and, whatever other images that we have. But in the Christian perception of heaven, it's actually also a temporary place. And it's a temporary place before the resurrection of the dead and the new earth. Did y'all know that? That it's not like a permanent place. I will get to what unity believes in a bit, I promise. I just kind of want to go through, we have these tapestries, and I want to call in the different religions. Jesus sits at the right hand of God and will return to earth with the second coming. So, again, we have this place, and it's what's interesting to me is how over the eons we've created the afterlife to resemble this. Yes, that it's very three-dimensional in many of the ways that we view it, as opposed to fourth or fifth dimensional. Now the Sikhs, again, the unity is more that it's a state of mind, but I want to get into that in a bit. Because I want to also stop and look at hell, because how can you go to heaven and you can't think about hell? And what's interesting is how many people think they're going to heaven? Probably everybody. But how many people think they're going to hell? Probably nobody, right? Except maybe someone else you might. But we don't think that here because we're in unity. So, probably our vision of hell is mostly from Dante's Inferno, right? Where it goes into all this detail about what it looks like. In Greek and Roman mythology, we had Hades, which is the underworld. In the Christianity and part of Judaism, if you look at the scripture, it can refer to hell as Gehenna. Gehenna was actually a garbage dump that was outside of Jerusalem, and it's where the garbage was burned, and it was where sometimes people were burned, and so it was said that if you were really bad, you would get sent to Gehenna. You would get sent to this fiery place. You would get sent to hell, and actually it was, like I said, it was a garbage dump. In Islam, the view of hell is a blazing fire and boiling water. So I wonder how many of you were raised with visions like that? Anybody? A few. So I applaud your courage, because what I have noticed is that when people have been raised with visions of the afterlife like that church is a very scary place, right? And church should be, or is for me, a place of love, of kindness, and of compassion, and not of scariness. And yet, how often has religion taken on that view of being scary? I've literally had people come in here sometimes shaking, and I'd be like, what's going on? And I haven't been to a church in 40 years or 30 years or whatever because of my background. And I have encouraged people to come and look at it in a different way. I even had one woman who had been so abused in her religion that she was terrified of God, because really that's what happens with it, right? And she said, I'm so angry at God. And I go, what would you like to say to God? She goes, I would really like to tell him off. And so I actually invited her to come here during the week one time, and we stood up here. And I said, I want you to say whatever you want to say to God, and just let him have it. Because you know what? God can take it. And she stood up here and she called God every name in the book, really. And then she was so afraid. She said she was afraid that she would get struck by lightning on her way home. That she would get, and I prayed that she wouldn't, that nothing bad would happen to her. And of course nothing did, but it was facing that fear. And again, I bring this up today because Halloween kind of turns our thoughts to that place. I was lucky enough to be raised United Church of Christ. And the image that I grew up with was of Jesus with his arms open. You know, it was just all this loving, kind, and compassion. And when I went back and read the catechism from my church, I thought, oh, they did believe in hell and this stuff, but nobody ever said anything about it, so I didn't really absorb it. When I was in ministerial school, though, I got a little flyer about Armageddon, and I thought, oh, this will be an interesting thing. This will be kind of a fun thing to go in, the book of Revelation. And I went, and it was some kind of a fundamentalist religion, and everyone was, the women were all dressed in white shirts and black skirts and had their hair up, and they were very kind. And then the service started, and the minister started, because he knew I was a visitor. I was with 2 other people. We were visitors. We were the only visitors in the church, and he wanted us to come up and get saved. We were the visitors. So he started preaching about the end of the world, and how that if we were not saved, we were going to go to hell. And I thought, I am not moving. There's no way I'm going up there. There's no way. And I swear to God, this man was like psychic, because he said, oh yeah, you'll go to a ballpark and you'll scream your head off, but you come to church and you're silent. And I thought, how does he know that? How does he know that about me? But I thought, there's no way I am moving from this place. And then finally the service was over. But what was hard about it was I would watch the children, and they would be on their hands and knees and praying to God and saying, please, God, don't send me to hell, don't. And that's child abuse, That is child abuse. So when it was over, everyone went back to normal, said, hi, thank you very much, good to see you, hope to see you next week. I was like, I don't think so. And I have to tell you that I was so filled. I am very firm in my faith, always have been. But I was so filled with fear when I was in that place. I was just terrified. And the first thing I did, because this happened in Missouri, is I drove to Unity Village, where they have a chapel that's open 24 hours. And I hightailed it to that chapel, and I must have sat there for 1 or 2 hours. Again, just trying to absorb the positive energy, right? The positive energy. So I think these are important issues to look at, because they form how we relate in life to each other, to the world, to God. Okay, so we've talked about heaven, we've talked about hell. What about reincarnation? That's another perception of the afterlife, is it not? And Hinduism has had the concept of a reincarnation for thousands of years. The Bhagavad Gita says this: as, after casting away worn-out garments, a man later takes new ones. So after casting away worn-out bodies, the embodied self encounters other new ones. And so we see that concept really rooted in Hinduism and in the Indian culture as well. The Yoruba people in Africa also believed in reincarnation, but they believed that when you reincarnate, you stay in the same family. So your uncle could reincarnate as your kid or whatever. And I think about that, I'm like, oh no. Can you imagine being reincarnated over and over and over again with your family? Nope, let's find some new people here. No. And of course, Buddhism believes in reincarnation, as does the Sikh religion as well. So what does Unity believe? So Unity believes that heaven and hell are states of mind, that we can be in heaven right here, right now, on this planet. We also can be in hell, because it is what we create in the moment, yes? And the second coming, the New Jerusalem, is the idea that we all wake up. We're all awake. What does that mean, to awaken? It means to love, right? It means kindness. It means compassion. It means creativity. It means that all of us together come to this place, and not 144,000 or whatever it is. That some of us get there and some of us don't. We all get there together. What I like about Unity is that the door is open to you to form your own perceptions of what is after, what happens after we die. What I liked about ministerial school is most of us believed in reincarnation, but not everybody did. And no one said, you have to believe in reincarnation if you want to be in Unity. Charles Fillmore, the co-founder of Unity, believed in reincarnation. In fact, he believed that he was the reincarnation of St. Paul. Why is it that none of us are like janitors, or we're kings and we're queens, and he was St. Paul? But for me, being raised United Church of Christ, I fell into sort of the view of reincarnation through a dream that I had. I dreamed I dreamed that I saw myself dead, only I was a little old man when I was 16 years old. Now, no one had ever spoken the word reincarnation to me in my life. I never heard of it. No one ever spoke of it. Didn't happen. And yet it was something that formed within me. So what is it that has taken root in you about your vision, your views of the afterlife, and how do they inform how you perceive life? How do they inform how you treat one another, how you look to this next dimension that is waiting for all of us? I believe that I go back and forth with reincarnation. Sometimes I believe it, sometimes I'm not sure. What I know is that we don't die, that we don't end. I know that we give up this body, and the universe is so vast. How could we cease to exist, really? How could that happen? This just doesn't make any sense. And that we may not take another human form, but I believe that it never, ever, ever stops. And I believe that it's wonderful and it's great. And I don't think that's a story, It's something that is deep, deep within me. So, Halloween. Heading into the darkness, the long nights, turns our thoughts to the shadow, turns our thoughts to the darkness, to asking the big questions in life. Where do we go? What happens after we die? And it leads us also to silence, to reflect on life's mysteries, not only of heaven and hell, but all of it. And I want to share with you that regardless of what happens when we leave, I feel like it's summed up in this next paragraph that I want to read to you from Alice Hoffman, a book called The Probable Future. This I know for sure. But where do we go? I used to think that there was a plan, a rough plan, but a plan all the same, the doctor admitted. Now, I believe there are 1,000 plans. Every breath, every decision influences the plan, expands it, shortens it, twists it all around. It's always changing. Those of us lucky enough to make it through the multitude of possible diseases and accidents and get old, we get tired, we close our eyes, and then, well, where are we then? Silly to ask him as though he knew, but in fact, the doctor didn't hesitate. He took Elinor's hand and placed it on his chest in the place where he knew his heart to be. And then, where are we then? Here. Elinor smiled and thought, at last someone has told her the truth. So no matter what concept we have of the afterlife, when we can go off into pearly gates and all kinds of, we can write stories about it, the truth is that where are we? We're here. Where are your loved ones? They're here. And that never goes away. That never ends. Happy Halloween.